Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Jakarta Tech Talk. My name is Serena, and joining us today is Reza Rahman, who will be presenting on the topic of Contributor's Guide to the Jakarta EE 11 Galaxy. If you have any questions for Reza as we move through today's presentation, feel free to ask them in the chat or use the Ask a Question tab. Without any further delay, Reza, over to you.
All right, sounds good. I think some people are going to have come in a little bit later because often what I see is like people can't quite figure out how to do the registration in between Meetup and Crowdcast and so on and so forth. But I'm going to get kind of do a little bit of a slow start here. Srina, do let me know if you can see everything from my side or not. Hopefully you can.
Yes.
If you can, just let me know real quick.
Yes, everything looks good.
Alrighty, so okay, well, welcome everyone. Those hopefully that have logged in. If you don't know me, my name is Reza Rahman. In my day job, I'm a principal program manager for Java on Azure. Basically, I try to make sure that Java and in particular Jakarta EE developers have a great experience working with Azure as a cloud platform. Today, of course, I'm not really here for my day job, although Microsoft is part of the Jakarta EE working group, so technically it wouldn't be too outside of my realm. But to be honest, primarily I'm here representing the Jakarta EE ambassadors today. And actually, for this particular talk, the Jakarta EE ambassadors is very relevant. I'll explain to you why in a moment the Jakarta EE ambassadors are relevant with regards to this particular talk. But of course, one of the reasons I do these things is to connect with you in person, and if you all try to rebuild the community that once was very, very strong. I'll talk a little bit about that also, but that is also part of the objective of today's talk is beginning to see how do we build a stronger community around Jakarta EE, in particular with the context of Jakarta EE 11. So what is the objective of this talk, and what am I hoping to accomplish in the next hour or so, plus or minus? Basically, this talk is about what could potentially go into Jakarta EE 11. Nobody really controls what Jakarta EE 11 is. Certainly, I don't. But we all can have ideas of what could go into Jakarta EE 11. And it's not too outlandish, right? So Jakarta EE is a platform, we've been around for a long time, and at least the core part of the community is pretty good about sort of having a mutual understanding of what should be going into the specification. Now, timing-wise, whether it's 11 or beyond, that's a separate question. But most people have a basic understanding of what exactly would be candidates for things that would go into the Jakarta EE platform. And basically, this talk is about sharing that information with you in the hopes that you will help make some of that happen. Right? So I'll talk a little bit about the significance of this in a moment also, but this is actually what makes Jakarta EE different from other things, is the fact that you should and can think about these things. You shouldn't just be sitting on the sidelines and being a passive consumer and, finally you have Jakarta EE 10, or finally we have Jakarta 11, now let me go and evaluate that and maybe think about whether that applies to my application or not. Of course, we want people to be doing those things. But really what makes Jakarta EE 11 is that you don't need to be doing that. You can be much more active and actually be a part of what goes on inside of Jakarta EE 11 to begin with, right? So you can get involved much earlier in the process. And that is part of what I'm trying to accomplish in the context of Jakarta EE 11 with this talk. So without further ado, let me move ahead. By the way, I did want to call out, this 5 years of Jakarta EE. Right? There's been, I think, hits, misses, and successes, and failures, and lessons learned. But here we are, right? To be honest with you, some of us didn't even think that this day would ever happen, let alone 5 years into this. So at least we can say a little bit of a tiny hooray, 5-year anniversary for Jakarta EE at this point. All right. So I'm going to assume most people that are looking at this talk know some of this stuff. This talk honestly is not intended for people this close to the community. In general, I assume people that are attending Jakarta Tech Talks are already at least relatively familiar with the platform. So I won't go too much into this. But the main thing that I really wanted to convey here is one of the primary objectives and one of the primary hopes of moving the whole thing from the JCP into something like the Eclipse Foundation was actually that JCP did quite a bit to encourage individual contribution, but not it wasn't really geared towards individual contributors per se. One of our objectives of making this move to the Eclipse Foundation was actually to foster that kind of participation. Foster what we have seen in many different open source projects that have pull requests every day and literally millions of stars and the stuff like that. And we wanted that for Java EE, for Jakarta EE. So frankly speaking, I don't know if that we really succeeded in that 5 years into it. Interestingly, what I observe is actually there was more individual contribution in the JCP days than has been throughout the last 5 years of Jakarta EE and certainly now. And this is something we really need to actively begin to address and figure out how do we change this, if we can change it. I hope we can. What I observe when I look around in the past 5 years is really the people that continue to be individual contributors. I can name some names: Marcus Karg, Arjun Tins, Werner Kyle. These are all sort of old guard people, right? They have been in this process since the JCP days. I see very few people I can name that are new people, net new people that have kind of come into the process and continue sort of that tradition, build on or strengthen that tradition of individual contribution into the Jakarta EE and Java EE specifications. So this is, if anything, what I'm trying to accomplish in this talk. At least if you don't begin contribution right away, maybe you can begin to change your mindset, about thinking about this technology set. So again, I hope most people that are looking at this talk already know this, but I'll just reinforce this, right? So don't let yourself be pulled into FUD, okay? Jakarta EE is very, very important. And if this technology does not remain strong, does not remain vibrant, the prospects for Java ultimately don't look very good. One of that, Jakarta EE and Java EE virtually is a secret sauce that has made the ecosystem as strong as it is. Right. So obviously, there's a lot of people still using. I see this in my day job all the time. A lot of people still directly using Jakarta EE implementation platform, whether that's Wi-Fi, Payara, Glassfish, JBoss CAP, Westfair, WebLogic, what have you. Right. Close to when the reality, at least from my perspective, and again, even from an Azure perspective, is close to 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 Java developers are ultimately using these platforms. So that alone tells you how hugely important this is, right? So this technology is. Even if you're not, let's say you're not using any of these app servers and you say, oh, app servers, oh, that's yesterday's news. Well, guess what? Even then, the stuff that you are probably using, whether it's Tomcat or Hibernate or ActiveMQ or Jetty or CXF or all of these things, even things like Microfile, Spring, Quarkus, what have you, ultimately they are all using Jakarta EE as a bedrock for all of these things. So for these things to remain relevant and for this ecosystem to remain vendor neutral and have more than one relevant player in it, Jakarta EE needs to remain successful, right? And that cannot happen without you, right? Just a few vendors and just a few people that have been around since the JCP and Java EE, we alone cannot make this happen, right? So this again, I hope is a message you will internalize, is that you have a responsibility in this as well. So again, I'll breeze over this. Where we are today is we just released Jakarta E10 not too long ago. There's already quite a few implementations. If you haven't tried this yet, begin to evaluate Jakarta E10. Obviously, I won't talk too much about Jakarta E10 in this talk. I'll touch on it a little bit. But now we're working on Jakarta E11, and the work has already started. Right? There's already work going on in Jakarta E11. So this is hardly talking about the future. Right? This is literally talking about the present and talking about what actually should be happening in the present and how it is that you can contribute. Lastly, the other thing that I would like to bring to your attention is that this is a live ecosystem. Right? So there has been many releases now. Believe it or not, there's already four releases of Jakarta E in the past 5 years. Right? So there are quite a few releases: Jakarta E8, Jakarta E9, 9.1, and now Jakarta E10. All of these things bring along changes, and in addition to that, Jakarta E is one of those ecosystems where there's a lot of other things around it. So innovation doesn't really just happen in the standards body. Innovation happens around the standard as well. So things like Quarkus, things like Microprofile, things like Helidon, things like Helonema. Literally, they're using virtual threads. The first major framework to embrace virtual threads. You don't get more bleeding edge than that. So a lot of stuff going on in this ecosystem. So this is more along the lines of that same FUD busting. So don't let yourself get into thinking, oh, this is a stagnant technology. What would I even contribute here? That's not the case. This has been a tremendous amount of work going on in the specs as well as out in the ecosystem, and you really should be thinking about becoming a part of this evolution and becoming a part of this journey. So, what is the heart of the talk today? Believe it or not, basically what I'm going to do in the remainder of the time that we have, about 50 minutes or so, is really just give you a synopsis, a Cliff's Note version of a document that already exists out there. And that document is the Ambassador's Jakarta E11 Contribution Guide. Literally, you can log on to this URL that I have now, log on to the Jakarta Ambassador's website, and lo and behold, you'll have this document in front of you. And what does this document represent? This document represents basically thought leadership in the community, primarily people that are sort of in that individual contributor space that have been thinking about what needs to go in the platform for the past 10 or 11 years. Now, the other thing that we have done is make sure that the things that we do put in the contribution guide are relatively vetted. Right? So this is not out of the blue, just somebody's idea that they haven't talked to anybody about that we suddenly put into the contribution guide. Most of the ideas that are in the contribution guide are well vetted. Right? So at least we have discussed it to some extent with the relevant stakeholders to say, yes, this is a good candidate for very. This is a likely. The possibilities of making this change in Jakarta E is legitimate. Right? We want to be making this change at some point in time in the future. So do be mindful of that as well. It's not just pie in the sky document that has no basis in reality. Right? This is stuff that responsible people that have discussed amongst themselves and come to some kind of agreement that yes, this should happen. Right? So that is the contents of the Jakarta E contribution guide really. So you should take it with a little bit more weight than simply, if you will, wishful thinking backlog. That's not the case. So with that, let's begin diving into what exactly is in the contribution guide, and again, gives you a Cliff's Note tour of what's in there. So we actually started the contribution guide idea not in Jakarta 11, not in Jakarta E10, but starting in the Jakarta E8 timeframe. Right? So this is a sort of a document that has a long history as well. There was a Jakarta E10 version of this document that was out pretty much shortly after Jakarta E8 went live, was released. Okay, so if you look at it, these are the high-level view of what was in the Jakarta E10 contribution guide. Okay, so you can see there's a number of different things, and I won't read off all of them. Right, we'll do a tour of all of these things in a moment. So no point in talking about all of this, and hopefully you've already at least maybe attended a few Jakarta E10 talks already. So a few of these things definitely have made it into Jakarta E10. Okay, all of the things that we've all had in our mind for many years. Some examples are asynchronous annotation, better support for CDI in batch, getting a way of using completion stages in a managed way in the platform, a Bootstrap API for Jakarta REST, things like OpenID connection support, and the like, right? So a number of different things. And of course, things like the core and the microservices profile, right? So a fair bit of things that we had in the contribution guide for Jakarta E10 for a long time did make it in. You can see the color coding here. Some things were in progress and are in progress, right? So these are things that are most likely going to make it. Whether or not in Jakarta E11, they're en route, right? It is happening. And that is the stuff in yellow. So these are examples of finally making Jakarta REST a little bit more Jakarta CDI friendly. Okay, getting things like some of these new specifications that we've been talking about for a long time, things like configuration and NoSQL, maybe standardizing into the platform. But there's also things that there's consensus, there's agreement that these things are important, but the work hasn't really started yet as far as we're able to see. Right? So those are the items in black. So the items in the black and yellow are the things that I'll be covering today, more so than what's in Jakarta E10. So if you apply a filter and you remove the stuff that was delivered, this is what remains. Okay, so the themes here are more or less what have been for some period of time. I'll briefly describe the changes here at a high level. So first and foremost, continue to do CDI alignment. A lot of this work, they started in the Jakarta E6, Jakarta E7 timeframe. It remains to be done, right? We really need to make CDI more of a central programming model and the only programming model that is necessary for Jakarta EE developers to understand. So there's work around this, primarily to move away from EJB, right? So EJB used to be the older component model in the Java EE platform, and we've been working for quite a few years now to finally get rid of EJB, right? We just don't need it anymore. It's just a redundant programming model that has hung around since the J2E days, right? So there's some work around this thing. There's a lot of valuable stuff in EJB today, like the at schedule annotation, the at lock annotation, the ideas of maximum concurrency that actually is embedded deeply within EJB, but isn't surfaced in the API. These are things that could be moving into the Jakarta EE concurrency spec. Things like message-driven means could be modernized, moved away, and putting into messaging as opposed to sitting in EJB. Things like rows allowed and run as very important annotations, but today still can only be used in EJB and nowhere else. That's something that should be fixed. In general, better CDI alignment, better CDI support, things that should be using CDI and knowing about CDI, actually using CDI. Examples of this is REST, persistence, and concurrency. I'll talk about the specifics of these, of course, in a moment. We always want to make sure that we are using Java SE. I don't know if you know this or not, but for Jakarta EE, Java SE really is the only dependency. So that being the only dependency, we need to make sure that we're consuming the innovations that are happening in Java SE. And we have a long history of this. Annotations, where Java EE was, back in the day, was the first major platform to actually embrace annotations. Things like the datetime API. So a lot of long history of consuming Java EE innovation. Similarly, there are some innovations that we could be consuming right now. Things like, for example, things along the lines of Java SE records as well as virtual threads. More Bootstrap APIs. I'll talk about that in context, and I'll explain to you what the motivation here is. And in general, greater modularity. So Java EE, I think, is too far advanced in a way in modularity to really accept JPMS as a modularity solution. But we could be doing more along the lines of modularity, and this has been sort of a ongoing debate for a very long time. And the TCK, believe it or not, is very, very old, right? When I still kind of, as an experiment, I opened up the TCK code, and it's still the code that I saw back in 2005 something. Okay, so it's very, very old code. This is stuff that could be modernized and made more standalone. A lot of the TCKs are sort of built into the platform, and that's it. You can't run them on their own. And this is something else that could be moved out and made more standalone. And of course, closing standardization gaps. There's always gaps that we need to close. I'll give you some examples of that. JWT auth alignment, bad job definition using a Java API, the ad service, potentially adding an ad service annotations, again, to replace the useful parts of EJB in a more modern way. And then finally, maybe we won't be able to get to it in Jakarta 11, but at some point, sort of deprecating EJB as a concept, just like we deprecated JSF managed beans as a redundant programming model. We said, okay, this is no longer needed. We already have CDI. Why do we have this thing? Getting rid of that. I hope we get to a day soon where we can say yes. Jakarta in the Jakarta EE platform, EJB is essentially on path to being deprecated. Right? So that is the objective here of some of the changes that we talked about with regards to CDI alignment. And finally, new specifications, right? We haven't really had net new specifications in the platform for a while, and it's overdue, right? So these are some of the things we could be thinking about. Is things like NoSQL, MVC configuration, repositories, and gRPC support. I'll talk about each of these in a moment. Actually, the only thing that I won't be talking too much about is the gRPC. So let me talk about more of that. So hopefully you know about gRPC at this point. It's a RPC protocol based on sort of the latest versions of the HTTP specification that allows you to do more or less remote method invocation. Right? It's a very old school sort of technology. It's nothing to do with the REST whatsoever. It's literally like binary protocol method invocation, much like what you would get in RMI or Corba, only using HTTP as a baseline. So this is actually pretty useful, something that could have a very bright future, and something that we could potentially at least make part of the umbrella specification, if not part of a specific profile, or even the full platform. It's important to have a standard-based API that does that, right? Because the more bleeding edge applications are using gRPC, right? There's some well-known example of those, but this would be a good candidate. But the API ultimately, I hope, will look something like Jakarta REST. So you just have your POJO, you throw in some annotations, and you don't need to know much about the internal details of REST, and basically the runtime takes care of most of the details for you. So this is the idea behind Jakarta RPC. There is actually a spec out there. Not a lot of active development in it, right? But maybe you could be changing that as well. And this is an area where you can begin your contribution process there. Okay. Let me stop for a moment. There's a question. I'm going to read the question aloud. And by the way, feel free to ask questions throughout. No need to wait until the very end. Okay, so let me read the question aloud here. Many applications are written using EJB. Deprecating or removing EJB means a lot of work for existing applications to migrate Jakarta and beyond. For example, Java's great aspect of the right ones run anywhere, string tokenized class for years. Even if we split the existing methods in the string class, isn't it worth keeping the interfaces and under the hood? So first of all, things are not deprecated in Jakarta EE that quickly. Second of all, even if things are deprecated in the spec, ultimately implementations can choose to keep it around for a longer period of time. Just because it's deprecated in the spec doesn't mean it is unavailable. Third of all, honestly speaking, it's time to move on. The EJB has been a ball and chain for the platform for a very long time. Yes, there's lots of people using EJB, but there's also many more people not using Jakarta EE because of EJB, right? So it is time we really thought about this and made some hard decisions. And maybe it's time to let go and just say, yes, we understand there's lots of people that are using EJB, but maybe it's time to look beyond that now, because that is what's going to be the future of the platform. And maybe stop thinking about what has been in the past. Of course, that's my personal opinion, and frankly, this entire talk is my personal opinion. So yeah, that would be my answer to that. Okay. For example, today EJB promote XML configuration instead of annotations. Stateless promote like RMI invocations. Could stateless tomorrow continue to have some features today, like promoting gRPC? Yes, absolutely. But we don't need EJB to be doing that. That could be done in a much more CDI-centric way. Okay. All right. Okay, so here are the things that are known, though, right? So there are some things that are definitely well understood at this point and agreed upon, right? And in fact, this is what I have in front of me in the on screen now. This is actually resolutions by the working group, by the steering committee. So this is the overall direction. This is not uncertain. This I can say for certain, unlike probably most of the rest of the talk. So the target release date for Jakarta 11 is around first quarter of 2014, so early 2014. Given if the past is any indicator, it's probably going to wind up being somewhere in the 2014 range. I guess it's probably midway through or maybe later in 2014 in all reality, but that is the target date. The objective is to get Jakarta 11 out by Q1 of 2014. What that means is that we will be using Java SE 11 as a baseline. That is what is going to be what we base the platform on. What that means is we can begin to target things like Java SE records. We can't quite begin to target things like virtual threads yet, right? We can begin to think about what virtual threads would look like, but certainly we can, by this point in time, things like Java SE records and all of the rest of the things that are in Java SE 21, these should be fully baked by now, and we should be able to begin to take advantage of it in Jakarta 11. And there is agreement on these things of finally moving past EJB and making CDI the central component model and sort of put EJB on a path towards deprecation. There is agreement in the steering committee that this is where we want to go. There's also a focus on new specifications and innovation. Right? So hopefully we hope that this will be a major component of Jakarta 11. It's not like Jakarta 10 where it's quite a few changes, but really it's mostly just maintenance of the existing specifications. We hope that there will be some net new specifications in the Jakarta 11 timeframe. And we are also encouraging independent specification releases. Now, short of having modularity baked into the platform, this is the next best thing. So we can make an argument that the future of the platform is actually not with the full platform anymore. The future of Jakarta is probably more along the lines of the core platform, the core profile specifications. So perhaps things like Quarkus, which hopefully will become Jakarta EE core certified very, very soon. Things like Helen, perhaps things like Open Liberty. Also, Open Liberty is a core profile implementation and is fully modular. What that happens is when you have runtimes like that becoming mainstream, that do not implement the full profile, but really just implement the core profile only, having the specifications independently consumed becomes a lot more important, right? Because those runtimes can then implement the core profile and then consume each of the Jakarta EE specifications on an a la carte basis, right? On a one-by-one basis. So this is when having these independent specification releases, as opposed to having whole platform releases, becomes very, very important. Okay. Now let's begin to dive into a few of the specific details, and this is where you need to think about what are the features, what of these features are compelling to you, and what are the features you think you can roll up your sleeve and actually begin helping implement, right? As opposed to sort of being on the sidelines, right? This is what is needed right now. This is what we need to move the platform forward and to realize one of the hopes that we had in moving Java EE into the Eclipse Foundation in Jakarta EE. So talked about this before. A lot of the good stuff locked into EJB. You can't use it outside of EJB and CDI beans, but they have very good use cases. These are things like the at schedule annotation. These are things like the at lock annotation that most people probably don't even know about. That's in EJB. It's hidden well under the hood, and that is very, very useful. It's a useful bit of semantics and a useful bit of work that has been done for some time. All we really need to do is unlock it, and literally, no pun intended, and make it usable outside of EJB, inside of CDI beans, and really maintaining most of the semantics pretty much as is. The semantics is good. It's just locked into EJB. Adding maximum concurrency. So EJB has actually this implicit concept of setting basically upper bound of thread pool sizes. In effect, that becomes a maximum concurrency threshold. Very valuable concept. Again, locked into EJB only. Right? This is something we could be making available as a CDI implementation that is in the concurrency specification, then consumable by any CDI bean, right? And I'll give you an example of this in context when we talk about message ribbon beans. Now, context propagation is another one, right? So virtual threads is an interesting concept that aligns with the whole Jakarta concurrency specification. So what is virtual threads? And what is it intended for? Why did the Java SE folks bother creating virtual threads in the first place? The use case for virtual threads is to basically get rid of a limitation that we had in the JVM, in that we only could have a certain amount of threads. Threads were expensive to create, so you can't have hundreds of thousands of them because you'll run out of memory. So this is the reason for existence of virtual threads. Virtual threads is basically a mechanism to have your cake and eat it too, to have many different threads but not run out of memory, not run out of resources. So this basically, if virtual threads live up to their promise, basically it means that we don't have to bother with things like reactive programming and non-blocking I/O, because there's a thread sitting that is blocked. It's no big deal because threads are cheap. Right? That is a fundamental idea behind virtual threads. In most Jakarta EE applications, Jakarta EE developers do not go about creating their own threads. Thread management is mostly taken care of at the runtime level. So this is a space primarily for actually implementation level innovation. So the implementers really need to think about whether they want to switch away from using native threads under the hood to manage Jakarta EE workloads, to manage Jakarta EE requests, and use virtual threads instead. So for a developer standpoint, for the most part, I envision to be no change, for this to be no change at all. Right? And there may be cases where it's proven out that virtual threads is not good for certain things, where they are for certain things. But this is something that really implementers need to begin innovating. Right? So there is some innovation already going on. Certainly, Heteronema is an example of that. And frankly speaking, Spring Boot. Right? Spring Boot now allows you to use virtual threads under the hood. So if you switch a flag, you set a flag, and Spring Boot will, under the hood, begin using virtual threads as opposed to using native threads. This is the kind of thing that we need in other Jakarta EE runtimes to pick up on as well. I'm hoping that Quarkus will pick this one up as well. And right now, Quarkus is based on the reactive model using Vertex, but maybe it doesn't need to do that anymore. Now, there is a use case where virtual threads can have some level of standardization in Jakarta concurrency. Where is that? Well, you know that you have the concept of managed threads, right? So if you absolutely have to spin up threads yourself inside of a Jakarta EE program, you can spin up managed threads. So similarly, we could allow you to spin up virtual threads. And why would we bother doing that? The only real reason is context propagation. So when you create a new thread, we want to make sure that the underlying Jakarta EE context, the security context, the JNDI context, the transactional context, the CDI context, all that stuff actually propagates when you create a new thread. If you just plain old create a new thread, well, you're going to lose all that context. So this is potentially an area where we could have managed versions of virtual threads in Jakarta concurrency to allow for that use case rather than the more general use case of using virtual threads for things like HTTP request thread processing and not using native threads for that. That's a runtime level concern, not a Jakarta EE API concern primarily. Now, believe it or not, even today, if you spin up a managed thread using the Jakarta EE concurrency API, one of the things that will not propagate is a CDI context, right? So if you have a request, for example, you create a request scope bean, you're going to lose that. So this is same thing for other things like even transactional scope beans. Those will all get lost because the CDI context is not propagated when you create a new managed thread using the concurrency API. So this is potentially something that needs to be fixed. And there's a little bit of a back and forth whether this should be fixed in the CDI spec, whether it's the CDI spec responsibility to do this, or whether it's the Jakarta concurrency spec to do this. And this is something that you could get involved in and hopefully begin to fix. Okay. So this is the CDI. Talked about the EJB lock annotation, right? Maybe you've seen this before, maybe you haven't. But this is how the semantics looks like. And we could literally make this available in CDI as opposed to something being only available for HAB, right? So it could look like, hey, let's say you have a shared service, right? It holds some mutable state that's shared across multiple threads. Well, by default, that thing could be read locked, right? So for the most part, when you're reading stuff, you don't need need that to be that can be reentrant. It's not a big deal. But when you're actually changing something, when you're changing mutable state, you should place a write lock on it, right? So while you're making that change, at that point in time, things are not reentrant until you're done making that change. Incredibly useful feature and a very neat feature whose semantics are already well understood. You just need to move it from one spec to the other and make it available for a larger set of beans. And the rest of it, as I'll tell you, I'll give you examples of. So I don't have examples of every little thing, right? So I'm just describing some of these things, but I won't have it. I will have examples for some key things. So now, the same problem with roles allowed and run as, right? By the way, you can only use this in EJB, and that doesn't make any sense, right? These are things you should need to use in anything that is a CDI bean, and this is something that could be done. Is again, the semantics of this is largely okay, right? And basically, it's just a matter of moving it from where it is today and making it available through CDI and available to a larger set of beans. Thankfully, we finally have support for OpenID Connect in Jakarta EE10. This is a long pending thing that, again, probably should have been done a long time ago, but we have that now. Now, another use case that really isn't met very well is what happens when you either want to use JWT instead, or if you're using JWT and OpenID Connect in the same application. Okay, so some work needs to be done here because JWT is, again, something very widely used. It's no longer sort of a new and up and coming technology. Now it's a proven technology in the cloud native space. And we need to do something here to make it clear how do you actually use JWT in a Jakarta EE application, whether that's using microfile JWT directly or indirectly, or moving microfile JWT into Jakarta EE. I don't know what the right answer is, right? But we do need to do something here, and this is something you could get involved in and help sort out. The EL-enabled authorization annotation, I'll give you an example of it. That's the best way to understand it. So hopefully most of you already know how the roles allowed and run as annotation works. Basically, it's based on, you have some predefined roles like admin or user or what have you, and you say, okay, per method or per bean, only that role is allowed to access that bean. Well, that's good and fine. It's called role-based security. So a lot of the times it's not enough, right? Sometimes security needs are actually a lot more complicated and a little bit more involved than that, but not so involved that you cannot express it in a simple EL-based annotation. So this is where this is an idea that has been around, believe it or not, since Java EE7, is to introduce an annotation that makes the best use of declarative style, like roles allowed, but also allows some more flexibility by incorporating expression language. Okay, and that way you can have a little bit more powerful set of roles. And these are things that already exist in other frameworks. This is something else that we could very easily standardize in Jakarta EE as well. And it wouldn't be too difficult, to actually implement this. This is something I fully envision just a non-vendor developer implementing a CDI interceptor to do exactly this. Right? It's not that hard. So there are things in Jakarta persistence as well. Jakarta persistence is probably one of the better known and better used APIs in Jakarta EE. It's relatively mature, but there's definitely things that we can consider doing in Jakarta persistence as well. So one other important things, and I think it's a gotcha, it's a gap, is being able to have thread-safe entity managers in a pure CDI context. And we could potentially solve this using also getting rid of another unnecessary redundant annotation called @persistence context and use @inject instead. So I'll discuss the details of this in a moment. We need to really think about how do we adapt to records? So records, by and large, are good for cases where something is a data transfer object. So JPA entities are not good candidates for that anyway, right? It's a DTO is not an entity. DTO is a copy of an entity. So it's unclear to me how that alignment would work, but there's some cases where there is potential alignment. For example, if you're using a composite key as an embeddable, well, that's read-only, right? You don't change those keys. So maybe that could be potentially records. But some really significant end-user analysis needs to take place in understanding what needs to change in JPA and what needs to change actually overall in Jakarta EE to take better advantage of records. And this is analysis you could be doing as an end user and bringing the results of your ideas and analysis back to the spec. Another one of my pet peeves is persistence.xml. Often, there's nothing really that important in a persistence.xml. It's very boilerplate stuff. All you're really doing is activating JPA for the most part. There's no reason these days in persistence.xml couldn't be completely optional. If you have JPA use in the application and you have a data source, well, you need to make a connection and create a persistence context. You don't actually need a persistence.xml. JPA second level cache providers, right? Today, these are basically proprietary. No reason that should be the case. We already have a spec for caching. It's called JCache, right? We could simply reference it and allow you to use a JCache implementer like Redis as your second level cache provider. Very easy change to make happen, and potentially something else that could be end user contributed to something like Eclipse Link to say, hey, this is how you use JCache as an API to offload your second level JPA cache. All right, so let me circle back a little bit to explaining what the problem here is with entity managers and CDI. So today you can do this basically conceptually. You can have an application scope bean. You can make it transactional because the transactional annotation is in JTA. You could have a transactional application scope bean just like this. You can also inject an entity manager just like this using the persistence context annotation and use these type of card style methods. But guess what? When you actually make the invocation entity manager.persist, that invocation is not guaranteed to be thread safe, right? Because the semantics of it is unclear. Semantics of it is clear in EJB, right? EJB tells you what's going to happen when you invoke persistent entity manager.persist in an injected an entity manager that's injected into EJB, but nowhere else, right? Nowhere else is this actually defined as to how this semantic is supposed to work, right? It only works in EJB because EJB effectively is thread safe. Right? A stateless session bean and a singleton session bean, those are all thread safe by default. This is not thread safe, right? And a CDI application scope bean has no thread safety semantics of its own. So we need to do something to make the entity manager thread safe in these contexts. And we've done this work already, right? We've done very similar work in JMS 2.0 for the JMS context. The JMS context, if you use it that way, that is actually thread safe already. Right, so we could be doing similar work by defining what the thread safe semantics are when the entity manager is used in an injective fashion like this. And we could improve upon this by saying, hey, you don't need to use the persistence context annotation anymore. Just use @inject to inject your entity manager. And as a byproduct, we will give you a thread safe one, right? That is already proxy, that already knows about transactions, that already knows about thread safety on its own. All right. Jakarta messaging is another important one, right, where there's a lot of pending changes because there hasn't been active development in Jakarta messaging for a while. The biggest one is creating a better version of a message of MV, the significantly better one. I'll explain in a moment how that would look like. I'll explain it via code example. A standalone Bootstrap API, I'll explain the use case for that. We actually need more of these in all of the Jakarta EE specifications. Jakarta messaging Lite, right? So nowadays you have Kafka, Apache Pulsar, so on and so forth. But when you look at these things, what are they really? Really, when you look at it, they are just more cloud native messaging APIs that are a subset of Jakarta messaging. So we could be making the existing Jakarta messaging implementations a little more cloud native and a little bit more competitive by actually defining a more modernized API that is called something like Jakarta Messaging Lite. Same thing with AMQP interoperability. This is something we've talked about in the Jakarta Messaging and JMS specification for a very long time. JMS ultimately uses a proprietary protocol to communicate between the client and the server. It doesn't need to. It could be using AMQP under the hood, and that way the protocol is actually transparent to the end user as well. So here's an example of what I mean when I say, let's make a better version of message-driven beans that actually is CDI compatible. Okay, so first and foremost, a message listener is a method level construct. It is not a class level construct. It doesn't need to be. So you could have any CDI bean that does other stuff, but also just listens to messages. It doesn't need to be a specialized component. And the semantics could be significantly better than what the message-driven bean semantics today is. So it could look something like this. You could just have a message listener where you specify via annotation attribute what destination you want to look at. It's a type-safe way of doing it. You can apply things like selectors in a much more nicer, using much more nicer syntax. You could even finally standardize things that are not standardized in message-driven beans but actually exist in real life. So things like retries, retry delays, dead letter queues. Right? These we could all begin standardizing this because every single JMS provider actually implements these things. There's no reason why we can't have it in the standard. We could do even more advanced things like, for example, allow for batch processing, batch message processing as opposed to singular message processing. We could do automatic payload unwrapping. Okay, just like I have in the example here. This is we're used to all of this already. This is the exact semantics that is used in more modern specs like Jakarta REST. Right, we could be doing the same thing for message-driven semantic for JMS messages as well. We could unwrap the payload and also allow you to look at the metadata through injection. Right, so if you want to look at a particular message attribute, that could be injected in a type-safe way as opposed to looked up like it is currently. Something like this is where maximum concurrency absolutely is relevant, right? So you want to say, hey, I want to, if it's not batch processing, let's say you're processing messages one at a time, you want to be able to say how many concurrent messages you want to be processing. And you can do that in a completely CDI specific way if we standardize something like max concurrency, right? The max concurrency annotation. And again, this in effect exists in JB, right? You can do it in proprietary ways today. So Bootstrap API, this again primarily exists in more modern JMS implementations like ActiveMQ. Okay, so they have a way where if you just want to spin up JMS on its own and maybe do something as simple as I want to send a message, well, you don't need an entire Java EE container to do all that. Right? You can just spin it up in Java SE and do meaningful things. So this is something we could be standardizing as well, is having a Bootstrap API just like, in fact, we now have for Jakarta REST for exactly the same reasons. Right? So you would create CDI, same reasons. There's a Bootstrap API exactly for that use case. We could be doing the same thing for JMS. This has been discussed for a long time now, right? Is spin up a JMS container on its own, do things like get the JMS context that will allow you to send and receive messages, and even be able to dynamically deploy and undeploy queues and topics, right? So here's an example where we're saying, okay, look up this JMS queue, and by the way, if it doesn't exist, just create it. That's what the true flag is for, right? So we could be doing similar things like allowing for programmatic deployment and undeployment of JMS resources in this type of context, in a Java SE based context. So configuration is a big one. To be honest, the configuration model for Java EE as it stands today is very old. It's primarily just limited to more or less annotations or XML. Okay, the industry by and large has moved far beyond this. Right, so you can most modern runtimes these days they're not using XML to configure themselves. Right, so they're using something like property files. Okay, they're using things like YAML files in some cases. Actually, Wildfly, you can as a Wildfly 20, you can actually configure Wildfly. You remember it used to be something like standalone.xml. Well, you don't need to do that anymore. You can use YAML to do that. More importantly, at a meta point, all of these configuration bits of configuration can actually be external to the application. Right? So it could be coming from property files, maybe, but it could also be defined in Java system properties or environment variables or some other external store altogether, something like Kubernetes secrets or secure cloud storage like Azure Key Vault or NoSQL stores or even a relational database. Right, so this has been talked about for a long time now. Finally, there is something, at least for Java EE developers out there, in microprofile config, but we need actually that in the Jakarta EE platform itself, because other specs like JPA could be modernizing the way they configure themselves using this configuration mechanism. So this is finally happening, right? Happening through Jakarta configuration. It's a project that, in my opinion, could use a lot more steam, right? And I think the way it gets more steam is more people hopefully get involved in creating these things and actually moving whatever is in microprofile configuration into Jakarta configuration. That is a consensus. Right? That is what the decision is to do. Here are some use cases for it. Simple use case, hey, I just want to inject something. More advanced use case, I want to get rid of the persistence.xml and whatever is done in the persistence.xml, do it in using a much more modern format like name value pairs in a properties file. Okay, Jakarta configuration should allow you to do this. I want to be able to reference, even if I am using XML or I'm using annotations, I still want to be able to reference environment variables, right? So that I can change my application at runtime or redeploy the same application across different environments by using environment variables. So these are the type of capabilities that Jakarta configuration should be bringing to the table. Okay, Jakarta NoSQL is another important one. Otavio Santana, by the way, I should have mentioned him as another example of an individual contributor into the specification. Again, somebody that comes from that JCP legacy. It's not somebody that came into this as part of Jakarta EE, yet another Java EE guy. But yeah, he does a lot of good stuff. Right. So one of the nice specs that he has come up with is Jakarta NoSQL. It's a specification for accessing NoSQL databases, just like you have Jakarta persistence for accessing SQL-based databases. It's very similar to JPA actually in nature. One of the clever things that it does is that it deals with NoSQL APIs by taxonomy, so by key value, column family, or document or graph. And it also has some nice integration with existing specifications like bean validation and config. Okay, so here's an example of how it looks like. Again, very, very similar to JPA, except with a little bit more of a NoSQL flavor and a little bit more modernized, right, because it is newer. So another thing that Otavio is one of the key drivers for, and IBM, to their credit, right? IBM also has done significant work in this. Something that we've been using forever and a day, right? So that is basically using a HARL instead of handwriting your repository code, having your repository code be generated for you using basically the repository pattern. Same thing that a lot of you are probably already using in Delta Spec data and Spring data. It's high time we standardize this both for Jakarta persistence and NoSQL. Thankfully, there is a beta release for this spec already. I'm very hopeful this will make it into Jakarta 11, at least in the full profile, if nowhere else, but maybe even in the web profile as well. It makes sense, I think. So yeah, as you would expect, you can have a JPA entity or even just a Java, just a plain old Java POJO, and instead of handwriting all the repository code, have it be generated for you based upon an annotated interface, just like this one, right? You put @repository on it, and then if you extend the default CRUD repository, well, it'll give you the CRUD methods: find by ID, find all, save, delete, create. But in addition to that, you can create more advanced finders, right, by using sort of declarative style annotations, just like you see here. Okay, Jakarta MVC is yet another one. I'm personally not convinced anymore that this needs to belong in the spec per se, right, in the umbrella spec, but I think it's legitimate as a Jakarta specification. And by the way, this already has had some releases, right? So this is an alternative to JSF that is much more action-oriented and arguably a little bit easier to use with the existing JavaScript frameworks than JSF would be. Here's an example of it. Really, the heart of it is that you have a view of some kind, usually XHTML files or what have you, and then you have a controller, right? And you do basically low-level HTTP mapping like get, post by hand, and then you do all of the rest of the manipulation by hand as well, just like you would in Jakarta REST. In fact, it reuses the Jakarta REST APIs. Okay. Here's some other potential changes. This one is happening for sure, right? So we're definitely getting rid of Jakarta REST at context annotation, yet another thing that probably didn't need to exist in the first place, and replacing it with just plain old at inject. By the way, in strong signal for this, it's already deprecated. At context is deprecated in Jakarta E10. It will be removed in the future. And as soon as at inject is available, I would advise you to just get rid of at context, okay, in your Jakarta REST code. One of the areas where definitely we can have better support for Java SE records is again in the DTO layer. And one of the APIs that absolutely applies to the DTO layer is JSON binding. Okay, so the JSON binding API really does need to support Java SE records, and I hope this work is happening. I saw some signs that this work is actually happening, but this is an important one. It's a small one, but actually very important in bringing being able to use Java records in a Jakarta EE application. These days, if you've ever written Jakarta batch applications, the job definition is in XML and usually pretty complex XML. There's no reason this needs to be, right? We can very easily create a Java-based API to do this configuration. I'll have an example of that in a moment. At stateless, again, a lot of good stuff, good semantics. It all makes sense. Outdated programming model and a redundant one. We could very easily replace whatever is in stateless using a simple built-in stereotype in the platform, and we could even call it something much more modern, like at service or at application service. I'll show you an example of it. So here's an example of a job definition API. By the way, I didn't even make this up, right? This literally exists in the Wildfly implementation of JBatch, of Jakarta Batch. It's just waiting to be standardized, right? So it's much more compact and a much more type-safe way of defining jobs as opposed to defining it in XML. It's just so easy to standardize this. Here's how a built-in at stereotype at the platform level to replace the stateless EJBs could look like. It could be as lightweight as this. Okay, so it could have as a built-in part of it to say, hey, what these services are always going to be transactional. The transactional service, please incorporate it. It is always going to be have some concurrency limits built into it and use the defaults, whatever it may be, 10, 15 concurrency, something like that could be built into it. Locking semantics could potentially be built into it right away to make these things actually thread safe. Maybe have a read lock by default and change it to write lock if you need to. So these are the kind of things that can happen in an built-in at service annotation. It can basically be a drop-in replacement for at stateless for the most part. And one of the last things I'd like you to think about, I'm almost out of time, so I need to finish up relatively quickly. If you have any more questions, do post it for me. By the way, there's work outside of the specifications, right? There's simple things like, hey, help create websites. Jakarta REST would be a very good candidate. Right? Jakarta Faces would be a very good candidate. Like, these are very useful specifications that deserve a nice website of their own. You could be helping create those. There's a bunch of other stuff like the starter, the tutorial, the examples, Eclipse Cargo Tracker. These are all things that are very, very easy to contribute to. You can begin contributing there. At service-like features. So here's a question. At service-like features CMT or BMT by EJB. By the way, BMT is long dead. There's no such thing as BMT. CMT is also long dead. This is a EJB2 context. These days, these things are replaced by JPA. So there is no no relevance for CMT and BMT anymore. If you want to talk about contact in terms of transaction management, yes, this would be more along the lines of CMT, container managed persistence. So the transactional annotation literally is a declarative way of saying per method, please make this method transactional. So that is BMT. Rather, so that is CMT. Okay, so I'm going to skip this over as well. This is well documented in the contribution guide. There's different ways of contributing. You don't have to be a spec implementer right from the start. Right? You could begin by just following the mailing lists, and there's a number of them. You can go and log on and subscribe yourself. You can at least express an opinion and advocate for a change to say, hey, let me go ahead and enter a Jira issue for this one. I think it's an important one. Or just chime into the existing Jira issues. You could be doing that very easily. You could be issuing small PRs. You don't have to be a committer to do that. You can be a contributor. And all you need to do is sign the ECA. It's equivalent to any open source project out there. And you sign the document, you issue your PR, that's it. Becoming a contributor comes much later. And if you really are lost in doing this and you don't know where to start, you can reach out to the ambassadors. Right? That's why the ambassadors Google group exists. You can reach out there and ask questions if you need to, and somebody will help you. So in summary, one of the key objectives that I don't know that we have fully succeeded in is building a real contributor community, not just a community, but a contributor community around Jakarta EE. 10 was a good opportunity to do that. 9 was a good opportunity to do that. 11 is a great opportunity to do that. So this is where you need to become more than somebody just consumes Jakarta EE APIs, and you need to begin thinking about becoming a contributor. Perhaps in contributing in some of these things that I talked about, that all have some level of consensus and agreement that these are important things to do. And the time to get involved is now. It's not tomorrow. It's not 2 years from now. This work is happening right now. You could begin to get involved right now. So these are some resources I'll leave for you. The most important resource is really the Jakarta EE contribution guide. It's also linked in this deck. I've shared a link to this deck in the chat. It is available in my speaker deck account. You can very easily use the deck there. And obviously, the deck is just a CliffsNote version of the actual contribution guide. You could also be taking a look at the contribution guide on its own. All right, so that is all that I have today. I think I'm almost out of time, but I think we can be allowed a little bit of leeway, and I'll take some questions if there are any. I can go back to any slides that people have any questions about. Other than that, I hope this was useful.
It was. Thank you so much for the excellent presentation today, Reza. And just a reminder for everyone as we wrap things up here, just to click on the Ask a Questions tab or add the questions in the chat. So I also, in the interim, while we're wrapping up, we're also looking to book some more Jakarta Tech Talks throughout 2023, closer to the fall time frame. So if you're interested in presenting, please feel free to fill out the form, which I will link in the chat. And of course, if there's any feedback on the Tech Talk program, we would love to hear from you. Just click on the green button that will pop up and let us know how you enjoyed the talk. So I'll just quickly go and look in the Ask a Questions tab for you, Reza, and see if there's anything that's there.
I don't see it. Yeah, I've been keeping an eye on it.
I don't see. Okay.
Monitor. Yeah, so we can maybe wait another few minutes, but it doesn't sound like there is anything.
Of course, I can also send any questions over afterwards as well to you directly, and you can respond. And I don't see anything else. Just some nice thank you from Kai. Yeah, and that's it. All right.
Okay, folks. Yeah. So again, I'm not very hard to find, right? So if you have anything you want to discuss, anything that's in your mind, you want to think about seriously about beginning contribution, please reach out to me, and always happy to have a conversation about it. To be honest, some of these people that I mentioned to you today, how did they start? Like, how did I myself start? Literally, it was a conversation with a spec lead, or a conversation that was already doing this kind of stuff, right? So yeah, always happy to have these kind of conversations, because at the end of the day, yeah, again, we need to begin to build that contributor community that really did exist in the JCP days, and we really at least need to get back to that same level, if not improve on it. But thank you for your time today. At least, attending this talk is a good step in the right direction.
Oh, we have a question from Sergio. So in the ask a questions is, what is the skill level a contributor must have? I joined the Jakarta data initial meeting, but found a little bit hard to follow up. I stopped attending.
So this is not an easy question to answer. It's contributing to any non-trivial open source project, and something especially as high level and as technically involved as Jakarta is not so easy, right? So you do need to have quite a bit of existing knowledge and existing skill level. I would say something to the tune of 10 years of Java development before you can even seriously begin thinking about making a significant contribution, right? But small things, like some of the things I mentioned, contributing to the Jakarta Examples project, or helping build a custom website for Jakarta Faces or Jakarta REST, or simply fixing a typo in a spec somewhere, that anyone can do. Maybe even somebody in school using a CS program in a CS program could potentially do work like that. But something like, let me make an actual contribution to Jakarta data, well, that's going to take a significant amount of skill. There's no getting around that. So this is where we need those experienced Java EE and Jakarta EE developers to also begin thinking about, how do I now give back to this community and help the technology move forward, not just newcomers.
Okay. All right. So that's everything. Thank you so much again, Reza, and you have yourselves all a wonderful day. Take care.